Hello, everyone. Welcome to the sixth session of the Silicon Valley Startup Forum at KAIST. My name is Yong Pak, and I am a professor at the KAIST College of Business, and I am honored to be the moderator for today's session. The Silicon Valley Startup Forum, hosted by the KAIST College of Business, invites world-class scholars and experts from the startup community to gain more insights regarding the founding and growth of innovative startups. The forum has a total of 10 sessions, and today we are excited to host our sixth session. Our speaker today is Professor Jerry Engel. Professor Engel is an emeritus adjunct professor at the Haas School of Business, UC Berkeley, and a senior fellow at the Leicester Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. Professor Engel is an internationally renowned expert in innovation, entrepreneurship, and venture capital, and he regularly gives lectures to corporations and governments around the world. Currently, pioneering the lean Launchpad innovation in the United States and around the world with Professor Steve Blank, Professor Engel will talk to you today about startup culture, the culture of innovation. Today, Professor Engel will share his insights and help us understand what factors have driven the growth of major startups around the world and the innovations that have emerged. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Professor Jerry Engel. Welcome, Professor Engel.
Well, so thank you very much, Professor Youngmark. So good to see you again.
Good to see you again. Yeah,
we haven't seen each other since I had the pleasure of having you in my class so many years ago, back in Berkeley.
Like 16, 17 years ago, yeah. So we have come full circle. Yep.
Full circle. Now you're the professor and maybe I'm the student. Yeah. That's fantastic. Well, I'll take a moment and just share my screen if I may.
Awesome. Okay. So while you're preparing your screen, I think we have some students checking in the YouTube live video.
I'd be very interested in where the students are geographically. I'd be very interested in, are they all, is everybody in Korea or people all over Asia?
That I don't know at the moment, but I'm guessing most of our students are checking in from Korea, either from Seoul or our Daejeon campus where our engineering school is.
Ah.
So we have two locations.
Where is that campus?
It's in a city called Daejeon, which is about a 2-hour drive south from Seoul.
I'm very interested in that because I'm very interested in essentially something we call clusters of innovation. In other words, innovation that is driven by location and how location has an impact on innovation.
And in fact, Daejeon is now becoming a cluster of science-based startups these days, thanks to our campus and the spillover effects. Yeah.
Fantastic. We'll talk about that, and maybe you can help me understand that better as we go through our lecture.
Excellent. All right.
I want to ask the technical question. Can you see my screen with my name on it?
Yes, we could see your slide.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. So today, as you said, today's topic is startup culture. And I was very excited when I was invited to address this topic because we don't talk about culture enough. So what is culture? And what is innovation? And why are they important in their interrelationship? Culture, when we think of innovation, and we'll talk more about this, but we often think of science, we think of technology, we think of new products and services, especially in the IT space. It's very popular to understand innovation through an IT lens. Of course, there are many areas of scientific and engineering innovation outside of IT, but we often don't think of what are the behaviors among people and between businesses that enable the acceleration of innovation and therefore constitute this startup culture. So when we talk about culture, we're not just talking about the components, but we're talking about the behaviors of those components. Now, why am I a person to address that? My personal background starts with finance, and I have a fairly traditional background. If we look on my slide where it says big company experience, back in the 70s and 80s when I graduated from university, and I came out of the University of California, Pennsylvania, the Wharton School of Business, I went to work in accounting and consulting and worked with the largest firms in the world, KPMG for 10 years and Ernst & Young or EY for 10 years. And in that role, especially the second role with Ernst & Young, I specialized in serving startups and emerging companies. And that was because I had moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. And that's an important thing. I'm not talking just about my history. I'm talking about culture. The East Coast culture was dominated by family businesses, older businesses, multi-generation family businesses. The West Coast was dominated by the transition of businesses from first agriculture to finance to logistics and infrastructure to, in the 1980s, the emergence of a semiconductor-driven industry. And I got to work in that industry at its fairly early stages as an advisor, as somebody who helped arrange financings for these early silicon-based startups, and then later on for the PC industry and ultimately for software. And I've seen these transitions. And that's given me a chance to sort of observe this culture of innovation over a period of time and to track what's common between these different generations of technology. As an entrepreneur myself, there were gaps in my institutional career or big business career where I took breaks and founded a few firms, some of which were very successful and some of which were total failures. And that's also part of the culture of innovation and the startup ecosystem, is accepting that not everything is a success. And when there's a failure, it's not necessarily a personal failure. It's really in how you fail. In Silicon Valley and in startup cultures around the world, we tend to look at failure as an opportunity for learning and not something to hide. Matter of fact, many executives looking for new positions in startups or in founding firms and looking to raise venture capital oftentimes speak about their failures as much as they do their successes. So they can show that they're learning individuals, learning always, learning from success and learning from failure. That they're modest in their egos, and they recognize that they're not the difference between success and failure. A lot of times it's the team and the circumstances. I've also had the opportunity to be a venture capitalist. I founded 2 venture capital firms, and both have been through the entire cycle from startup through maturity and liquidation. Both were successful, and it gave me a lot of experience seeing the difference between being somebody who advises versus somebody who does startups versus somebody who invests. And these roles are very different. They might deal with the same knowledge, but the way you use that knowledge and the type of decisions you make are totally different. So it's important that we appreciate these distinctions. That just because somebody knows a lot about an industry, even knows a lot about the business models of an industry, even has a lot of expertise, doesn't make them a great entrepreneur in the space or a great investor. That's a combination of not only that knowledge, but other attributes as well. And of course, I've been at the University of California for 25 plus years. And I came to the university as sort of a volunteer to help start their entrepreneurship program. And as your professor indicated, we called it the Lester Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. It's now called the Entrepreneurship Program of the University of California. I personally ran that program and developed it for the time I was at Berkeley as an active professor. And I'm now an emeritus professor, still advising students, lecturing in the classroom from time to time, but mostly dedicating my time to writing, research, lecturing in executive courses, and international lecturing. So my background is relevant in that you see all these different roles that I've transitioned through. This is a common attribute of startup culture, that people in startup cultures have to be flexible in their own self-definition of what they're doing. Because sometimes they'll be contributing as an individual contributor, sometimes as a team leader, sometimes as an investor, sometimes as an educator. And it's very common to see individuals have multi-dimensions in their capabilities and their personalities. So today we're going to discuss this culture that we've begun to look at, and how the culture of innovation is not necessarily the same as the culture of entrepreneurship, and how they're distinct. And then we're going to look at the geographic influence on this culture. And we're going to call that, again, the cluster of innovation approach. And when we look at the geographic influence, we're going to talk specifically about how entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and major corporations interact together. And we're going to also be discussing how corporate innovation strategy should take advantage of looking outward through open innovation to incorporate and embrace things in their environment, and why they should do that. So first, the culture of innovation. My lens on the culture of innovation comes from my home. And this is a picture of my university and its central point. And when we look at innovation, we should always look first, I think, at a local lens. Well, you might say, I'm an expert in semiconductors, or I'm an expert in artificial intelligence. I want to look at innovation through the lens of my industry or technical expertise. That's okay, but that's what everybody else is doing. You should, of course, do that. But the value-added thing you can do is say, now how does that knowledge sit on and interact with my local ecosystems, the strengths and weaknesses of where I reside? And globally looking, where are other ecosystems that have other complementary skills and market access? And always thinking locally and globally at the same time. So the Haas School of Business, where I'm a professor, has a slogan that we've been operating under for almost 20 years, which is leading through innovation. I actually think leading through innovation is a profound statement. It sounds like a marketing statement. Oh, we're the best, we lead through innovation. And I'm sure every school in the universe has a slogan about, what they do and why they do it well. The reason I like this slogan in particular is because of how I understand innovation. I understand innovation, my personal definition. You probably can't find this if you look it up, because I just made it up about 20 years ago. As a professor, I have that sort of privilege to make up concepts and say, this is what I believe. And I believe innovation is nothing more and nothing less than a positive, proactive response to change. It's stimulus response, but it's not stimulus response like your knee jerking when you tap it. It's not stimulus response out of habit. It's not stimulus response like when you poke some plants, they actually close up like a Venus flytrap. It's not response by instinct. It's proactive, intentional response. It's like there's a stimulus, and taking that stimulus in and saying, what does this mean? How has the world changed? And how has my view of opportunity changed because of the stimulus? Well, what's a stimulus? Here's an obvious one, right? I mean, most stimuli are not this overt. You know, a lot of times the expertise that a great technology innovator brings is recognizing a remarkable stimulus. COVID-19, everybody saw it. And how are we going to react to it was the question of the day in March 2020. Some reacted by pulling back, and that might have been appropriate. Some reacted by leaning in when they had windows to do that. So who wins and who loses in response to stimulus? Well, this global awareness of this particular stimulus made it a good test case for us to understand. And the results were very clear. We, right now, in this moment, look like this. This is a picture of us. Now, I can't see you in gallery view. Oftentimes when I give lectures, I can see everybody, and my classes look like this. They've looked like this since March of 2020. I've gotten quite used to it. But this was shocking when I first started. How could we, the questions were raised. Can we still teach? Can we still connect? In some ways, we've learned we can connect better. And in some ways, not as well. But we will never teach the same again. Some people benefited from this, and some have been adversely affected. So no matter what, this stimulus was so significant that going forward from March 2020, it's a collective pivot point. It's collective insight. Across all of society, everybody had this impact. It's not like a technological breakthrough that some experts see happen. And they say, oh, because of that technological breakthrough, oh, bandwidth is increased, or compute speeds are higher, or data sets are larger, you know, that these underlying shocks to the system are understood only by a few. This is a shock understood by all, and everybody in our collective society worldwide will be seeing everything through the lens of pre and post COVID-19. So who's been hurt? Who did not respond well? Well, take anybody with physical assets that depended on people coming to those physical assets, whether it's a restaurant or a hotel or whatever. Initially, all those businesses on this slide, we see airlines, Delta Airlines, Marriott, hotel chain, of course. Bookings is, you know, a open table platform that, you know, makes reservations. These things had collapses in market value because their businesses essentially went away overnight. We had jobless claims just accelerate. I mean, dramatically in the United States, with, you know, in the first month here in April, in 2020, we had 22 million jobless claims. In Taiwan, 23 million population still had huge claims. So we had as many claims here in the United States as, let's say, the equivalency of the population of Taiwan, Australia, you know, Chile. But it's like those whole countries, not in fact were unemployed, but in the United States, we had that kind of job loss equal to those populations. In April still, because of COVID, but also because of geopolitical conflict between Saudi Arabia and Russia, we had oil drop in value to actually negative. In other words, all the oil usage slowed down. Oil storage capacity was filled. And if you had 1,000 gallons of oil, you couldn't give it away. There was nowhere to put it. All the tankers were filled. All the ships offshore were filled. There was no storage. So it actually cost money to get rid of your oil. Went below zero. By May, now we see the separation, right? The one we're all aware of. By May, Zoom, this little company with no assets, just some capability, is worth 50 billion, 48.78 billion to be exact, worth more than the 7 largest airlines combined. We still are in July having bad news. In July, we still have the separation where what we call the FANG stocks, Facebook, Amazon, Alphabet, Netscape, Netflix. These Microsoft, these companies are up, 500% since 2013. You see a sharp rise right here. This is March, where all the markets collapse, and they respond. These few companies really respond. Where the S&P, it takes a sharp drop and responds, but that response is largely these stocks in the S&P average. By July, Tesla's worth more than most other automobile companies, even taken together. We have certain of the solutions, the IT solutions, being identified as the winners: Zoom, Cisco, and Microsoft. But Cisco and Microsoft are much bigger companies with much larger invested asset bases. Zoom is coming out of nowhere. And what we see, and this is a very important chart to me, is that the response time of the stock markets, and I understand stock markets are only stock markets and they're not the underlying economies, but they're an indicator of what investors' expectations are of the underlying economies. You see that you have a 34% drop in the stock market in response to COVID, but by day 100, it's fully recovered. In other, severe situations like the 2000 dot-com bubble drop, in the financial crisis of 2008, the great crash, you have this shortening period of response time. I mean, what's the lesson we can take away from that? What we can learn from that is that markets have learned to differentiate that when there's an economic crisis or an environmental crisis, while it impairs everybody, some people are going to be able to take advantage of it. And therefore, and you have a break in the economy. And that's what we've had. We've had a fracturing in the economy, where those more stagnant companies, not able to respond, not in a position to respond, not prepared to take advantage of this new world, they get truly impaired. And there's so much of a shift of value to those that are prepared to take advantage of the world. They take off even faster. This response also filters all the way down to the entrepreneurship economy. You want to say, why is this relevant to innovation entrepreneurship? Because this happened in the venture capital financing marketplace in spades, even in a multiplied fashion, even greater inflection to this. So there's an old saying, some attribute to Richard Hamming, great 20th century scientist and computer engineer, some to Louis Pasteur, that luck favors the prepared mind. And I truly believe that. It was lucky, you might say, that Zoom was in the position it was in. It was lucky, you might say, that Microsoft had acquired Skype. you know, but what that reflected was people saw a long-term trend. They weren't expecting this spike. They weren't expecting this disruption, but they saw a long-term trend, and they were betting on the long-term trend. And when you bet on a solid long-term trend, when there are shocks, you're ready to take advantage of them and really leapfrog. So we have Zoom, we have the vaccine. If you look at the vaccines that have been commercialized, every one of the vaccines is built on the back of innovations that happened at small companies, relatively small companies. Whether it's, notice the name here, if you can see, that the Novavax vaccine is BioNTech Novavax. Moderna, you see Pfizer, AstraZeneca, all these companies built their vaccines on technologies that were brought to market or made viable. Now, and it might seem like an overnight success, but the mRNA technology had been used on SARS vaccines, and this ability to develop a quick response was there. And it had taken years and literally billions of dollars of investment, but they were ready when the shock came, when a major new market happened. So this process of moving from research to a viable, hugely scalable market is reflected on this S-curve of innovation, where on the vertical axis, we're looking at product performance. In the horizontal axis, we're looking at investment and time. And the development of these technologies that seem like overnight successes, like Zoom and mRNA technology with the vaccines, and many more, they've really been in development for decades and incremental steps, but they haven't hit a market explosion yet. So who's doing this process are different players. The sweet spot that entrepreneurs and venture capitalists want to participate in is not the research, but they want to engage. If you're I know a number of you watching now are hard tech, deep tech, engineers and scientists, and you're engaged in the hard work of building new knowledge. But as you build that new knowledge, and whether it's in artificial intelligence, deep learning, these are the hot areas today. But wherever you're, maybe you're working in biology, maybe you're working in materials, applying it to semiconductors, these inflections where your particular innovation is going to be in such demand, that's indicated here, this early inflection moment. And then venture capital can be rapidly applied. I know Professor Steve Lang talked to you about lean innovation and experimentation and how you go through these cycles of innovation. I'm just going to take a moment, make my cursor a little more clear. Maybe that'll help. Here, I think this is easier to see. Quick cycles of short experiments. And these may be different companies that are born and die, recreated, acquired by big companies, all going on in here. And then this is a space where big companies truly need to take over. Either you need to grow a big company out of this space and become a Facebook or Google, or you have to be acquired by one, because truly global operations are something that just requires, at scale requires the type of backbone and capacity of a major corporation. So different participants in this process play different roles. Universities and research organizations, they take that early part. A lot of times in the United States, that's government funded. And in Korea, I would suspect also as well, but major corporations sometimes engage in funding research at universities. But it's not likely that universities themselves any longer are doing the fundamental blue ocean research. That's the way it was in 1950 and 1960 when you had AT&T Bell Labs, you had Xerox PARC, and many corporations taking that long-term approach. The world has changed. Entrepreneurs and venture capitalists are often given the opportunity, essentially, to create the startups, the gazelles that experiment in this middle period. And then major corporations are watching this entire process if they're good, if they're practicing open innovation in a great way, if they maybe have a corporate venture capital arm that's looking into this process and part of the deal, they maybe participate. But they are here really to help globally scale. So a theme we may mention later on is the role of speed and scale. The entrepreneurs and venture capitalists bring speed of experimentation. Major corporations can bring scale. They can't bring speed for a number of reasons. There are a number of barriers to them operating with the flexibility. And a lot of it's cultural. So when we talk about the culture of entrepreneurship and the culture of innovation, that's where we move the culture of innovation here with discovery, and then the culture of entrepreneurship of taking discoveries and experimenting to find those opportunities that are prepared to scale when we have a shock. So I think I'd like to take just 5 minutes here as we transition to the next step and respond to any questions either from my colleague professor or from you. So if you would put your questions, we're going to stop several times. This is not the end of the lecture, but let's take a 5-minute moment now so I can respond to your questions that you can type into the YouTube channel. And I can also respond to any points that your professor thinks I should emphasize.
All right, so thank you, Jerry. So would you rather have the Q&A in between these topics that you're talking about rather than having the Q&A afterwards?
I think so. I think it'd be good to have a little discussion now and then a little discussion sort of in between each one. And then a long discussion period at the end. Right,
because sometimes when questions start to come in, they start to pour in. So
I'll do a limit. I would like you to give me 3 questions. That's all. Okay? And then they can be the first 3 or whatever. And then the next time we'll do 3 questions, and that's how we'll do it.
All right, sounds good. Sounds good. So while our users are typing in their questions, maybe I'll start with a question. So you talked about the startup culture, the culture of innovation, the difference between the East Coast, even in the United States, and also learning from failure. So can you connect the culture of learning from failure and how failure is taken in the community, or sometimes it's stigmatized depending on where you're coming from. It's especially true in other parts of the world. But what's your experience across the country, even within the United States, about failure?
I'll speak from my personal experience, and that might make it real. So I did mention I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, when I would meet somebody, and I would be like 25 or 27 years old, and I'd say hello, and they'd say hello, they might say, "Oh, Jerry Engel, are you Dave Engel's son?" And I go, "Why, yes." And they go, "Your father is an excellent dentist. My cousin used to go to him as his dentist, and I remember meeting him. In other words, I was my father's son." And while I'm very proud and very happy to be my father's son, if I were to fail in that environment, it might reflect on not just me, but my father, on my whole family. And so what was valued in my family when I was growing up was hard work. My family were not entrepreneurs. They were teachers and professionals, dentists, doctors. And what was valued was that you did good work and you worked hard and your community respected you. When I moved to San Francisco, I was about 33 years old, and I was newly married, and I had no business connections, but I was hired by Ernst & Young, and I was supposed to go out and build my own practice. And I would go out and I would meet people, and nobody ever asked me who my father was. Nobody ever thought of that. The culture in San Francisco, at least in technology, was about what deals are you in? What deals are you seeing? Why do you like them? And you could have discussions with peers, many, many times. And while people were willing to talk about personal attributes, they really were interested in talking about this business of new products, new services, and your thoughts about what you were seeing and who you knew in that world. So it was more about creating a network, very much of a network community, and connecting not because of what religion you were or what family you were from, but connecting through a network of ideas and people who think the same way. So some people thought consumer software was the thing that was going to happen. Some people thought software was, literally when I started, people thought you couldn't invest in software because they said all the assets, human assets, intellectual property, left the building at the end of the day. So how can you, venture capitalists literally in 1983 were saying, how can I invest in software? There's no there there. I can invest in a personal computer company, sure, Apple, and I had like 20 different personal computer clients, literally 20 different companies, only 3 of whom, many of them were very successful, but today, how many of them survive? 1. It's Apple, right? All the others for various generations of the personal computer died, including Gateway, and I could list them. They were fine companies at the time. Anyway, one of my clients was the first personal portable computer. It was actually like a suitcase that you would carry around, and it was a great idea until the entrepreneur made the mistake of announcing his next generation while he still was manufacturing the current generation. Bad mistake. So anyway, that's a type of mistake that he learned from, but it literally sunk the company because people said, I'll wait for the next version to come out. And the company didn't have the financial robustness to survive. That computer company was called the Osborne Computer. It was a public company. It was a big success. It was thought to be that Apple was like the first and Osborne was going to be the second, and they were going to be big rivals. Didn't work out that way. So it's about community being focused on innovation and about communities being learning communities. I hope that addressed your question. Maybe yes. One more question and then
yeah, sure.
Go back.
I don't think we have a question posted in the chat window right now. So maybe I'll just do a follow-up question regarding your answer. So it seems like you're saying, failure is taken differently. It could be a positive thing in the West Coast. The East Coast, they treasure the family tradition. It's a little bit more conservative, which is very much like Korea up to this point. Now, from that perspective, it's very interesting to see how New York or Boston, these cities have become, the startup hubs, and now innovation and entrepreneurship is thriving, even in places like New York. Mm-hmm. So, do you have any thoughts about how those culture changed over the recent years? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it really has a lot that actually ties into the underlying tech as well. Yeah. Boston was, I hate to call East Coast West Coast but that's what we call it. Right. But it was really more whether you were in a tech hub or not. Philadelphia was not a tech hub, right? It was East Coast and not a tech hub. Boston was East Coast for sure, even a little bit more east, but it was a tech hub. Annalise Saxenian did a great comparison, which I think holds up, of the regional advantages of Boston versus Silicon Valley. And a couple of differences that she points out about Boston, and I can reflect that book's, that research is a couple decades old, so I can update it. But what she initially observed, and she predicted very wisely, that Boston would sort of sunset in terms of its innovation power. And the reason she predicted that was the initial technology that Boston was powerful in was mini computers, first of all. From mainframes to mini, that big shift. I mean, that was DEC, that was Boston, and then the computation around that new platform. Now, there were other, of course, technologies, but that was the major one, and storage and memory and all the things that go along with that. So you have these steps in the computer innovation cycle, from mainframe to mini to personal, right, to the internet and mobility. What she recognized was that because of the location of the companies, they used to call it the 128 circuit, which is a highway around Boston, that people identified more with their companies than with their professional status. The companies were not clustered together, they were strung out like pearls in a necklace. So you would say, I'm an IBM person or I'm a DEC person. You wouldn't say, I'm a software engineer. I mean, your first word would be what company you're with. In Silicon Valley, that's rarely the first word out of somebody's mouth, because people are more mobile, they move more quickly between companies, and if they want to say something they'll say today, oh, I'm a deep learning guy, and I really like to work on big data sets. Oh, I happen to be at Alphabet, or DeepMind or something like that. It'll be the second thing they say. That distinction she saw back in the 90s. That because Silicon Valley was a smaller geography and the companies were tighter together, that they socialized more. Engineers socialized with engineers, software people, socialized with software people, at bars, and they would talk, and ideas would move around, and you had a faster pace of innovation. So while Boston has maintained itself as a tech hub for sure, if you look at the numbers of dollars invested in venture capital, et cetera, it used to be equal. And now it's significantly less than Silicon Valley, even when you narrowly define Silicon Valley. And it's also concentrated, it's become more of a biotech. In other words, it's rotated its technologies. So it is a great tech hub, and they have great venture capital. So New York, why New York, right? Or why Berlin? I think New York and Berlin are like comparable. So, it's because of the creatives, right? There are communities. The advertising agencies were in New York, right? The theater was in New York. That was what was there historically, right? And you have this thing called, consumer software, anything consumer facing. Well, advertising agencies were already there, and they were already had a legacy of decades of creating consumer-facing visual entertainment or audio entertainment. So even though LA has a big entertainment base, they didn't have the advertising agency base. So the advertising agencies, I think, are the legacy, and the new generation, we say, oh, well, New York, apps, B2C, that's New York. And I think you can say the same thing for Berlin. I really don't know the legacy of Berlin and what was going on there before, but Berlin is an innovation hub, but it's more of a B2C software hub. And so it's a bit narrower definition, and that's fine. And the people in Munich like to think, oh no, we're the innovation engine. And it may become, things ebb and flow, right? So anyway, those are how things are different. And Philadelphia, by the way, has become quite a biotech hub now because they have a legacy of pharma there. And sooner or later, we're all innovation hubs. It just depends on what our legacies are and how we manifest them.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. So the East
Okay?
Coast, West Coast thing is too simplistic to understand the complex, innovation culture in the United States, I guess.
Yeah. So let's look at the culture of entrepreneurship in
Yeah.
general.
And then we'll come
And
back. Well, as we are talking, there were some questions posted in the chat window. We'll come back to these later on.
well, if there's one we certainly will. If there's one you want to call out now, we can. But we can move on to the culture of entrepreneurship. I think.
Yeah, we'll come back to these questions later.
Okay, very good. So entrepreneurship, if you're going to have a culture of entrepreneurship, we have to understand first the actor. Who are the actors, right? And there are a lot of actors in the culture of entrepreneurship, and we're going to talk about them. And I think there are 7 principal actors. But the first one, and the one we're going to dive deep on, is entrepreneurs. And who are entrepreneurs, and what are entrepreneurs? And this gets into your East Coast, West Coast discussion that we were having a lot. Entrepreneurs are people who look at the world through an opportunity lens. You might say, well, what else? What other type of lens could there be? Isn't everything opportunity? And I'm saying, no, there's another lens. And that other lens is resources. So how's that different? Well, Howard Stevenson really articulated this in the 80s, and it still holds up. I've seen no better definition than Professor Stevenson was at Harvard, wrote many books, one of the first entrepreneurship professors. And he said the pursuit of opportunity beyond the resources you currently control. That's the definition of entrepreneurship. So implicit in that is that you've identified an opportunity. And you're not just executing on a vision because you have the resources, but you actually have to get the resources. So what does that mean? That means you have to be able to articulate the opportunity. Well, to attract resources. And these resources could be people, money, technology, but whatever it is, you're a small team. Maybe you're 1 person, maybe you're 5 people, maybe you're 10 people, but you have a vision. And no matter what you can do with those people and the money you have, there's more to be done than you can do with just them. So that means you need to be able to convince people who have whatever it is you want to share it with you. And in exchange, you're going to share some of the future with them. So this isn't a loan, right? Because there's nothing secure in what you're sharing. It's a vision. So this is the fundamental of sharing equity with those that provide you resources, whether it's employees that are joining your company and sharing equity with them because they're giving up the opportunity for security, or whether it's people sharing technology and licensing you technology, maybe from a university, not only promising them a royalty, which is in a way a quasi-equity slice in a way, but also maybe sharing with them some residual equity, and also investors. That's clearly the exchange there is cash for equity. So in order to have that exchange, you need to be able to show the opportunity in a compelling way and attract it. And by showing it in a compelling way, you're showing 2 things. 1, the opportunity, and 2, your capacity as an individual to conduct the entrepreneurial process. And both of those are captured in this definition of entrepreneurship, the pursuit of opportunity beyond the resources you have under your control. Implicit here is the fact that if you have the resources under your control, even if you're looking at the same opportunity, maybe you're inside a big corporation and it's the same opportunity that the startup is looking at in the big corporation, but if the big corporation allocates to that activity sufficient resources, you're doing wonderful work. You're doing innovation, but you're not doing entrepreneurship. In other words, you're managing, and managing is wonderful. Nothing negative about it, but you're managing innovation and not doing entrepreneurship, which is not having the resources you need. That tells you a lot about the different cultures of innovation within a large company and innovation management in a startup. So when we look at the tasks of the entrepreneur to identify the opportunity, which is what's the need, who's the customer, what's the customer segment, what's the solution, connecting the need and the solution together is the value proposition. And then, okay, it's enough to see all that, but in order to pursue it, you need an unfair advantage. And that unfair advantage word, I simply mean you need to have some distinctive competence or capability that is not a commodity. It just can't be bought, right? It has to be something unique to you and your team to make you attractive. And if I said to you, which is harder, to identify the opportunity or to acquire the resources, I think a lot of you would say maybe identify the opportunity. Not so. And I could prove it to you right here. Seriously, each one of you listening to this presentation, if I said to each one of you, call up a friend, and I want the two of you to talk for 15 minutes. You're not going to have the chance to do this. But get on a Skype or get on a chat with a friend for 15 minutes, and your challenge is come up with an opportunity, an idea that you think is a good idea. I am confident that everybody watching this presentation, in partnership with somebody else, not necessarily alone, but the key ingredient is two people talking to each other, can come up with an idea. Then I say, okay, how many of those teams of people can turn around and execute to acquire those resources? It's going to be 1 in 20 or something like that. So based on that, I'm going to suggest that 90% or, the hardest thing to do is to learn how to acquire the resources. Yes, you need an outstanding opportunity. But that's just part of the job. It's a totality of using these perceptions of opportunity as a way to justify getting the resources and learning how to communicate that, learning how to have these conversations. And it's not about a slide deck with 10 slides and having the slides in the right order and giving a great pitch. That's a tiny part. Much more, it's about the conversation. So, the entrepreneur's task is to focus on opportunities where they can attract the resources. Don't focus on opportunities where you don't think you can attract the key resources. And the ultimate entrepreneurial dilemma is captured, for me, in this Robert Frost poem. And I think many of us know it. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler. Long I stood, looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Looking way down there, but I can't go there. Then took the other, just as fair, having perhaps the better claim. Because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though, as for that, and passing there, had warned them about the same. So the point is, in that Robert Frost poem, the author decides to take the road less traveled. And oftentimes, opportunity means not taking a new road. The key to why this poem is so telling is, entrepreneurs are seen as, breaking new ground and doing remarkable things. But we're going to look at some examples. Entrepreneurs don't necessarily take a new road. Oftentimes, they're the 2nd, 3rd, or 100th traveler down a road. But they just have one different fact, one different circumstance. Maybe they created or the world changed. And it made it more advantageous for them. But the dilemma of not being able to do both things. Doesn't mean you should go out and always do the unusual thing. But here, you can't go down both roads. You're either going to go down this road or this road. And that's the entrepreneurial moment, because there's an opportunity cost. There's a risk. You're going to take a bet. You're going to go on a journey. And that journey is going to look like this. This curve I drew years ago when a colleague of mine, Professor John Freeman, joined me at Berkeley. He came from Cornell. He had been at Berkeley and he'd gone to Cornell. He came back and he was a senior academic. And I was the pra-academic. I mean, as you might have remembered from my introduction, I'm an adjunct professor. What that means is I'm a full professor, but given credit for my practical experience. That's what I'm recognized for, not necessarily my academic research. I'm a venture capitalist and an entrepreneur and a finance executive. And it was my expertise in growing companies that was recognized by my academic appointment. And John Freeman, as much as he had been the superb researcher, did not have that expertise of practically building companies. So we were going to partner together at the Lester Center, and he said to me in a very friendly tone, okay, you're so smart, you're the pra-academic, define entrepreneurship. And I told him about Howard Stevenson and da-da-da, and he said, yeah, I know all that, but I want your definition. And I said, okay, well, I'm very happy with Stevenson's definition, but I'll tell you about the journey. And I drew on the whiteboard in my office one line, just this curve. So it looks like a sine curve. It's not really a sine curve, but it looks like one. And this curve showed something simple, that you were negative cash flow for a period of time before you created value. And for me, this was technology entrepreneurship. There are entrepreneurial opportunities, perhaps like, if you can think of one where you generate gross margin and profits right away, but that's not your typical. In technology entrepreneurship, you have to spend money on product development, you have to spend money on marketing, you have to spend money on attracting and retaining clients or customers before cumulatively you start to generate profits. So we talked about this a lot, and I want to share with you what I learned. I learned that this process that sounds so simple actually has 4 different phases. And this first phase here is, to me, the most crucial and differentiating that we're going to talk about in this lecture today. This is the entrepreneurial phase where you're experimenting, spending as little money as you can because you have limited resources. And you want the longest period of time to get convinced or committed to a specific value proposition, to a specific market segment, to a specific initial minimum viable product. And that's this moment of commitment. Once you reach that moment of commitment, or as you approach it, you then raise resources against that idea, story, business model, business plan, however you want to convey it. You raise resources from outside parties, raising as much as you can justify by the valuation you can create. And you spend it as rationally but quickly as you can, as long as you can be reasonably efficient, because you want to achieve a monopolistic advantage. You want to be that first mover who gets the bulk of the market, and then you can defend it. Now, sometimes that first mover is actually the second mover. Look at Skype and Zoom, etc., WebEx, Skype, Zoom, how they all migrate. But what you want to get enough market here in this activity so that then as you rationalize and not, control your spending, you create great profits as you scale. So that's the journey. And we used to encapsulate, this is where it's going to sound familiar if you remember Professor Blank's discussion, where he talked about the idea that the old idea was that we would develop a single business plan, and now we recognize that we have a two-stage process. And this is lean innovation process, whereby the first step before that first bar, first vertical line, is the discovery phase. And in that discovery phase, we have the humility to recognize that what we think we know is a guess, because we can't really know. And then we get out and deal with customers and test our hypotheses before we commit to execution. So this process also maps the way we raise money. And in the Q&A, we can talk about the difference between seed and venture capital and late stage, and how that affects the culture. And it maps against this process of the entrepreneurial journey. So incremental commitment of resources as we build value. And this is, the blue line is the value of the enterprise. And it's interesting, if there are any finance folks on the call, to think of how you have a clear value demonstration even though you have not generated profits. In the old way of thinking, in the old Philadelphia way of thinking, you might say, this is called nonsense, because they would say, you can't be worth anything, you've never generated any profits. And this is so uncertain, this future you're telling me about, so uncertain, how can I discount that back and have it make any sense? I don't understand it. That's what somebody says who's not from a cluster of innovation. From a cluster of innovation, they say, oh, what's the idea? Does anybody, do the dog eat the dog food? You know, is there anybody buying it? Is there any validation? Oh, there is. Oh, can you prove to me how you're going to attract your next 100 customers? Oh, you have a distribution model, you have a sales model that can scale. Oh, you've proven it, that you've actually done it. Now you've proven it's predictable. All those things happen probably before you've generated profitability. And you match your financings against that. And this builds that culture of innovation and culture of entrepreneurship. You can have a culture of innovation without this incremental building, right? You can do that in a large corporation with more of a budgetary approach. But this incremental testing, validation, and the ultimate validation is, of course, will people invest more money in you at even a higher valuation? This idea of actually collaborating with your investors, having a mentor relationship, where we oftentimes think of the governance relationship of a board of directors, that's appropriate when you're out here preparing to be a public company. But when you're in these early stages, you're far too fragile to have a heavy-handed board of directors. This is, again, the culture of entrepreneurship. It's having a mentorship relationship in these early stages. So this process I've seen roll out as part of industry innovation over and over again. This is simply the computer migration and level steps we talked about before, moving from mainframe computers, starting to use integrated circuits and personal, mini computers and personal computers and the internet, mobility, etc. The thing you see whenever you study these industries, Clayton Christensen at Harvard pointed this out, these gaps where the next platform does not actually perform as well as the old platform. And how does one, there's a whole discussion we can have about how one takes advantage of this situation. Why is this an entrepreneur's advantage that, in fact, the new innovation is going to perform worse? And in short, it's because it forces the entrepreneur to find a new market segment where the existing enterprise is serving old, proven market segments and may not think this new innovation is worth messing with yet because the market segments they're looking at are not interesting. They're not big enough, or they're not the price advantage is not good enough. This happened with personal computers. Why didn't the large mini computer makers and even the large computer makers like IBM really dive into personal computers? And IBM, I know as an exception, did for a while have a major initiative. But why were they so hard? Why did they even allow Apple to arise? Why did they even allow all these competitors that were my clients to arise? It's because they didn't see that there was this big consumer demand until it was already proven. And those businesses that were already in this rapid scaling stage and rapid experimentation stage. So when the large computer makers, particularly IBM, introduced their computers, they had huge advantages, but they weren't the sexy new machine, if you will. And they quickly became the legacy machine. So this process of waves of technology and having the second wave have a disadvantage from the first, but having certain advantages, this repeats over and over again. And big companies are always slow to the game because they want the world, their customer base, to see a smooth escalation of technology. We've seen these mistakes, even if we just, I can point to many industries, but we all are familiar with the personal computer industry, so it's a good one to talk about. I mean, Microsoft was at one stage a disruptor, right? When they came in with their operating system. But, you know, very soon they became the incumbent, in other words, a large company. And, you know, would just not be able to handle these transitions to new platforms like Vista. I mean, if anybody remembers Vista, it was a horrible product, but they forced everybody down to it rather than recognizing that they ought to bring Vista out on a machine to address a new market segment. They tried to impose it on their existing customers. They do it over and over again. You never want to get a Microsoft version 1.0 product. I'm a little worried about the 11, operating system they're bringing out right now. I just bought a computer today, personal story, with Windows 11 on it. Probably was a mistake. But we'll see if they repeat their error. So, what about innovation in a major corporation? Major corporations are the best, absolute best at incremental innovation. I mean, if you want to see the best new headlights on an automobile, fine. Look at what BMW is doing in headlight innovation on the automobile. But if you want to see a new electrical platform for the automobile, you don't look at, BMW. Yeah, finally, 10 years later, they're bringing out product. You looked at Tesla, right? You looked at the new companies, the companies that were willing to bring out, frankly, an inferior product in many ways. Not inferior because the car wasn't as good, but there wasn't the infrastructure, right? Where are you going to charge it? All these things in the whole system of a product. We all know that a product is not just a product, it's the whole system that supports it. We're not there. But now we're at this crossover point. And the question is, in automobiles, can the existing large companies make that shift? I mean, they're all going to try, and sure, some will achieve it, but think of what they could have done, perhaps show you an example of what they could have done. So this electrical automobile, not a new idea. All right, here's the first one, 1890. You might say, okay, Jerry, Professor Engel, if you want to be fancy about it. Okay. Yeah, there was an electrical automobile in 1890, but, never caught on. Not true. Here's a Porsche 1901. It's a hybrid. Not only is it electrical, it's a hybrid. And do you know that the electrical vehicle dominated the automobile industry globally until 1920? There were more electric vehicles on the road until 1920. It was the Model T. This is not a Model T. This is the 1914 Detroit Electric. The whole company was called the Detroit Electric. And that's why I like this, because Detroit is the legacy city in the United States where they made automobiles. And electric, and that was the name of the company. And it was a good company. Now, but, okay, the Model T, and I don't have a picture to show you, just had such a price advantage. And it had the operational advantage of the range, of internal combustion. That was a major disruption. And the other major disruption, the reason it had a price advantage, was the assembly line technology they used, etc. But that's another story. So, okay, the electrical vehicle gets disrupted by the internal combustion engine. We have new highway systems, new highways being built in the United States that link together vast distances. So you're not just driving 100 miles, but you're driving 1,000 miles potentially. So having gas stations is easier than having electrical hookups, because electricity in 1920 was only in the urban areas. So lots of reasons about infrastructure. But then you say, what's this? And I'd love you to look at that picture. This car was on the street in 1997. So no, it's not a Tesla. In 1997, General Motors introduced the EV1. The EV1 was a fantastic vehicle. And in 2003, they repurchased from the owners every one of them and crushed them and destroyed them. So Elon Musk did not take such a big risk. Remember, we were talking about the fork in the road? The pattern was clear. He had seen the EV1, and he understood that it was a beautiful, beautiful car that people loved. The customers who had this car loved it. Why was it created and why was it destroyed? This is a story of the problems of corporate innovation. General Motors at the time was the largest automobile company in the world. California at the time is the 7th largest economy in the world. It's now the 5th, just the state of California. California often leads in regulating industry, especially around air pollution. And the California state government imposed a regulation on automobile manufacturers that in order to be able to sell even one car in the state of California, the 5th largest economy in the world, 2%, only 2%, but 2% of all the vehicles they sold in the state of California had to be zero emission. Well, there's only 2 technologies I know of that can be zero emission. One is electric, and the other is a fuel cell. Well, fuel cells a long way off. Maybe it could be used in major trucks, etc. We could talk about that some other time. But electrical vehicles, people knew how to create them. You know, they weren't doing the technology all that well, but Ford, everybody was going to comply. You know, Ford developed an F-150, which is their classic truck. They simply put a lot of batteries in the bed of the truck. It wasn't a very attractive truck, but, you know, it worked. But this EV1 was a ground-up innovative vehicle. I mean, it wasn't some conversion of an existing car. They designed this exactly the way a Tesla is built. The batteries were down on the bottom in the chassis. Well, while they were spending tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to develop this car, they also spent tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars influencing the legislature. In other words, in the United States, politicians have to raise money to communicate their message and get elected. And unfortunately, you can influence politicians by contributing to their campaigns. It's totally legal in the United States. So at the same time, General Motors is bringing out this revolutionary car and spending money to make this car not necessary. And when they achieve, at the last minute in 2002, that's when it was going to be enforced. It was in 2002, the legislature said, you know what? We're not going to worry about that law. We're going to take away that necessity for zero emission cars. General Motors could have said in 2002, yeah, but we've run this experiment. You know, we have this great car and it's out there on the road. We have thousands of them being used in California and people really like them. We could have a little division and experiment. No, what did they do? They crushed them. They bought them back and crushed them. That's how much a major corporation resists changing its core business. Because when General Motors makes one more internal combustion car, the margin is pretty good. Where the margin on these EVs might have been zero or even negative. And they weren't ready to invest in a car that was going to compete with their core competency. Today, Tesla's market cap is greater than General Motors and Ford combined. Companies are tiny. Tesla is tiny compared in number of employees, number of cars manufactured, number of customers, compared to Ford and General Motors, but it's more valuable than both of them combined. Okay, does that only happen once in a while? Yeah. This kind of disruption where you get ready for it and then it's there, you've seen it over and over again. And every time there's a disruption, there's an opportunity, whether it's a technology or a business model. So what are the technologies that people have been investing in where we're ready for disruption, and where are we going to see it played out? You can look anywhere you want, but I just want to give a couple examples. I've already referenced artificial intelligence. If you want data, and as an academic, I know we like to see data, but even as a pracademic, I like to see some too. You look back to where was AI being deployed in 2015, and you look at a heat map. In other words, red means that's the number of deals being done. This is venture capital investment, right? Venture capital is being deployed in 2015, mostly in healthcare. Healthcare is a good place to deploy technology early because it's not as cost sensitive. Because if you can do something better in healthcare, it saves lives. The second market that's hot here, if you look carefully, you can see is advertising and marketing. And given that this is a data analytic process, it's obvious why advertising and marketing is good. First of all, there's data. And deep learning and these methodologies depend on there being data. It's not enough just to have an algorithm. You have to have the data on which to run the algorithm so the machine can prove itself. So you can first develop reasonable algorithms in the first place. So those two early markets make sense. You go from there and you come back 18 months later. Where's it being deployed? Same heat map, same database, same number, developed by the same people. And wow, yeah, healthcare is still up there, but look at this. This is the current year here. This is 2017. It's being broadly distributed. So this is just to give you a sense of that inflection, that moment of takeoff. We're well past that moment. So you can look around at the data, and there are AI startups everywhere, and the most impactful right now are probably in fintech and cybertech, etc. So another capability-focused technology that's, incorporates artificial intelligence sometimes, but definitely, built on blockchain, etc. Another, new metaphor, new capability is cybersecurity. So these platforms need vertical markets. I mean, there is no market for cybersecurity. There's no market for artificial intelligence. There are markets for solutions that use cybersecurity. There are markets for solutions that use artificial intelligence. And these markets are sometimes, the convergence point of where opportunity sits. Yes, if you have a broad platform, you think you have a better ability to do artificial intelligence than anybody else, God bless you. Try and build a company on that, great. It's a lot easier to deploy your better capability against a need, a specific need. So it could be in real estate, it could be just insurance, automobile, autonomous, agricultural technology, or health. But all these applications, are where you see the power of the technology. And these applications, and these have all been sort of fintech examples, because I wanted to pull up this quote for you from Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. And in a way, these institutions are at risk, because you can see it in what they say about themselves. This is going back 2 years ago that, Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, was saying, we're a technology company. Oh yeah, we're an investment bank, but we're really a technology company if you lift the covers. JP Morgan saying exactly the same quote. So what that really means is they know they're threatened by technology. And now, this is the New York Times, which I hope you know is like the newspaper of record. It's the best newspaper in the United States. It's recognized as like all the news is fit to print. That's their slogan up here, that they're the editorial voice and news voice for the United States. This paper is from September 5th, 2021. So just, a couple months ago, right? And what I saw, I took this picture sitting at my desk because I was reading the newspaper, and I saw this headline: officials, that means government, worry as crypto boom invades banking. And so officials, in other words, government regulators, they don't know how to regulate innovation. And Bitcoin is possibly, going to be very disruptive to our modern method of controlling currencies and controlling transactions and making things untraceable and taking them outside the regulatory regime. And I think it's clear we've already reached a point of disruption here. So the point of this discussion is just to make the point that is on this graph, that the major organizations and even governments can't evolve at the pace that technology does. That those of you on this call that are engineers and scientists, you see the rate at which technology evolves. Regulatory platforms and business platforms don't move that quickly. And that's why we have the entrepreneurial process that creates new platforms. Major corporations can do something so well. They can invest in people, they can invest in market knowledge, they can develop products that address customer pains, they can develop comprehensive customer solutions, not just products, and they can even dedicate resources in stages. But what they don't do well is experiment. Failure in a major corporation is like failure in Philadelphia. I mean, it's hard to live through failure inside a major corporation. It hurts your career. It's hard to prioritize speed. They want to prioritize other things like customer satisfaction and safety and not making a mistake. They don't change speed. If you're doing things incrementally and slowly because you're being cautious, once you have a market segment light up, you don't tend to all of a sudden apply 10 times or 100 times the resources against it. Where in venture capital, that's exactly what you're looking for. Your first round of finance might have been 10 million. Your next round might be 30 million. And then around after that might be 60 million. And you're just spending the money as well as you can spend it as fast as you can. Corporations tend to offer lifeboats. One of the things that, what's a lifeboat? Well, you tried hard, Mr. So-and-so, and we respect that you tried hard. Because you tried hard, even though your business idea didn't work out, you're not fired. There's another chance for you because, lifelong employment and you're a good soldier, etc. You've taken a risk. In entrepreneurship, your idea fails, your business fails. There's no lifeboat. So you have this risk of failure, which people say, oh, that's okay, we tolerate failure. Yeah, we tolerate failure, but it's still failure. And your business still is done. And it's very hard inside a major corporation to build the type of culture that is seeking additional resources all the time. And that's what I mean by always selling but not for sale. Entrepreneurs are always trying to acquire resources, but they're not trying to sell the company. Because once you try and sell the company, you failed because you've reduced the value of your enterprise once you try and sell it. So companies that have succeeded at this beautifully, have the ability to create huge steps up in value. The data on this slide is comparing a decade from 2012 to 2021. And, Apple went from being worth $400 million in 10 years to being worth, well over $2 trillion. This is as of November. This is as of early November. I have a feeling if I looked it up today, it's higher than 2.4. Not certain, actually. Trillion is, Google or Alphabet is going from being worth 300 million to being worth 2 trillion. Oracle is the contrary example. Oracle has become the incumbent. Back in 2012, Oracle was a high flyer, database company, very sexy, not sexy anymore. Look, in 10 years, they've only increased their market cap by 100 million. Not at all in the same league of where Facebook came from 0 to like $1 billion, and Salesforce came out of nowhere, actually spun out of Oracle, and it's worth over 300 billion. So if you do this well, if you play this game of incremental, radical, and disruptive innovation well, and even can participate in architectural innovation, which is business model innovation, if you play the game of looking at existing capabilities and existing markets, and understanding what's appropriate in each circumstance, where if you're in an existing market and you're deploying, an existing technology, it might be new, but it exists, it's proven, that's big business's world. If you're bringing out a new business model, if you will, this is it could well be an entrepreneur's world. If you're bringing out a new technology in a new market, that is the sweet spot for entrepreneurs. And the ultimate damage, if you will, or disruption is done when you take a new technology and deploy it against an existing market. Because here you still have a new market, you have to prove the market exists, you have to scale the market, etc. And here when you have an existing market, you bring out a new technology like Zoom, etc., and a new use case. That's truly disruptive. Oh, why do I think Zoom is disruptive when we had WebEx and Skype, etc.? I think the single thing that made Zoom so disruptive is you did not require any pre-meeting enrollment in anything. In Skype, you had to have a Skype name and you had to sign up. In Zoom, you just needed a link. You sent a link to somebody, they were there. And that ease of adoption made all the difference in March of 2020. So, we can talk about examples of, adding one blade to a razor, right? Is how Gillette tried to differentiate itself from its competitors. How, Canon, with its wonderful technology of fluid mechanics, was able to take the copier business that Xerox had in B2B and bring it to the home consumer, to the printer. HP being a big distributor of their printers now, but still using the Canon technology. Of how radical innovation by Ford actually displaced the electrical vehicles. That was a new manufacturing technology. And the new market were people who wanted long distance travel versus local travel. And universities are ripe for this type of disruption. Coursera, if you know it, is a massive platform for online education. Again, I use the Zoom example. So maybe we could stop here, and then I'll talk about the geography of innovation next. As you've heard a lot from me for a while, and maybe a question or two would be great.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And we do have some questions in the chat window. And I think the first two questions are related to our discussion about, the West Coast, East Coast, but which is also related to your next topic of cluster of innovation. So maybe we could start with the third question first, which is about with the COVID-19, each country's policies seem to be flexible and rapidly changing venture culture and life cycle a lot. The question is, how does COVID-19 impact the changes in the graph that you showed earlier? And I think the graph is referring to the overlapping technology S-curves, the Christiansen thing. Mm-hmm. Does that technology curve change in any way because of the impact of COVID-19 or any shocks?
Well, I would simply say what it did was create more visibility on the experimentation in that rapid escalation part of the graph that you have. You just COVID-19. In other words, preparation. The key point there is that the preparation along the longitudinal side had to be done in order to be in a position to take advantage of it. It wouldn't have been something you could, say, oh, hey, telecommunications is going to be important. Remote learning is going to be important. Let's develop a solution. No, you had to be prepared in advance. That's the big lesson there, is that, and to be prepared in advance, you don't prepare yourself for a shock. Nobody sits around, well, I'm going to do something that's really going to be important in a pandemic. Because timing in an entrepreneurial venture, you just can't sit around with a capability. And say, okay, I'm ready for the pandemic. Whenever it comes, 5 years, 10 years, I'll be here. No, you have to build for a market. That's what we say, a new market. Build for a market that you think is going to sustain yourself and that you can incrementally grow and take advantage of. And if there's a shock that you can take advantage of, then you're prepared. It's being prepared for it. So it's not a business strategy to be prepared for a shock. It's a business strategy to be fundamentally grounded in a good value proposition. But whenever there are shocks to the environment, say, how does that affect me? And how should I change what I'm doing?
All right, thank you. I think there are two more questions, and both of them are related to our earlier discussion about New York, Boston, Silicon Valley. So while you are addressing these two questions, maybe you can naturally go to your last topic, which is the cluster of innovation and geography.
Sure.
Yeah.
So just tell me what the questions are.
Yeah. So number one, the first question is, do you think the gap between the East and the West still exists as much as it was a few decades ago, especially for younger generations? Okay.
Say real quickly, no. It's the gap between clusters of innovation and non-clusters of innovation. So it's not as geographic as it was. And you probably can see that in your own community. Go ahead, next.
The second question is, what are the differences between the 90s startup culture and the current startup culture?
Okay, and I'll segue real quickly because I am aware of our time, but I just want to say real quickly, in the 90s, startup culture was more isolated. I mean, the impact on society as a whole was significant because in the 90s we were doing, fundamental capabilities in computer chips and architecture of computers. So it was important, but it was really only done in small locations. Now it's a global process, and that's going to be our transition here, because it's really, it's not an evenly spread process, but it's a global process. So when you look at, a hotspot of technology, like this is a map of Silicon Valley, and Berkeley is right over here. My home is actually up here where it doesn't look like there's anything. Right now I'm talking to you from over the second hill right there in Marin County. This is San Francisco. Here's all the computer companies, yada, yada. Now, what's important are a few people. In other words, it's a human interconnection. These few people are at the top. Here's the president. Here are the leaders of major technology companies, but not just the leaders. Everybody underneath them, it's the people and how they interact. So whether you're in London or in Singapore or in Germany, in Munich, or in Melbourne, or in Moscow, or in Tel Aviv, or in Barcelona, or in, where was this one? This one is, oh, it's you, isn't it you?
Yeah. Is that so?
Yes, right. How funny. So no matter where you are, right, it's how the people interact. So this is a banner that was up I was in Tel Aviv talking on this topic, and Clusters of Innovation 2014. So this has been my topic for a long time. And I had just written the book, Global Clusters of Innovation. And I was out meeting all these people, and they were showing me all their innovation centers and accelerators. And we all know Israel has a great startup culture. But it's when I came back to my hotel in the middle of the night, and I saw the folks hanging this banner up for an event that was going to happen the next day, where they were going to have, sort of engineers coming together for a meetup. That's what told me, oh, I'm in the right place. That culture was behavior. So Michael Porter told us about industry concentrations, and I was not surprised when I came to Silicon Valley and I saw all the semiconductor companies in 1980. What did surprise me over the years was seeing photovoltaics, biotechnology, electrical vehicles. These industries really emerged in Silicon Valley. They emerged elsewhere, but big indication that a lot of the spurring came from Silicon Valley. And so what I really learned in that process was seeing that certain communities, I got the instinct that certain communities are better, and not just certain industries, right? We always know certain, people are better at certain industries, but certain communities are good at certain industries, but also good at creating new businesses, creating new industries at rapid evolution, formation, destruction, renewal, high velocity of the pace of creative destruction. I mean, certain communities, and that's what we're going to talk about as a cluster of innovation. So Silicon Valley is built on a legacy of defense spending back, post-World War II, and that led to semiconductors, and aviation, and biotech, and personal computers, et cetera, et cetera. But it wasn't necessarily so. None of this happened in a vacuum. It was because of a culture emerging, and I call that the geography of innovation, and kind of an ecosystem drive innovation. So this is where we start to have the discussion of the role of the university, the entrepreneur, the venture capitalist, and the major corporation. This is the secret sauce, this process. But it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in partnership with management. And a lot of the folks on this call right now are in this circle. They are professional management, some of whom are involved with entrepreneurial firms. And it's this professional management that has a sensitivity for the entrepreneurial process. They're the ones that help scale, get up that raft that goes vertically. It's the management talent that does that. It does it with the support of professionals, like I was at EY, and I specialize in this area, and many lawyers specialize in the area, and with this role of government. Government, whether it's Korea or China or the United States, has a huge role at enabling this process. And sometimes it's the major corporations that have a huge role. Sometimes it's government. Sometimes it's the venture capital community. But what's true is that all the components interact. And it's how they interact. And this is the sort of the concluding major theme for you, is that I want to focus on not so much on the components, the 7 components are very important, but what are the behaviors? And I'm going to suggest the behaviors are an inclination toward mobility, entrepreneurial process, and we've described that pursuit of opportunity beyond the resources you have under your control. Doing so with alignment of interests. And we talked about member sharing equity, and that's the fundamental way for alignment of interest. And with a global strategic perspective. And we discussed having a global window on opportunity, not just a local one, but built on local competencies, using global linkages to get to a global strategic perspective. So what are these 5 behaviors in a little more detail? The resources that have to be mobile are money, people, and know-how. And you say, well, what does that mean? Well, money is mobile when it's put to work by people who understand they're taking risk, and they're taking it for a period of time, and the money is going to go into a company but not stay there. They understand that they need to get the money out to either redeploy it into the next venture or distribute it back to the people that provided it. So this is the essence of the venture capital process. It's why venture capital drives innovation and entrepreneurship. It's not only because it's money, but it's mobile money. It's money that's meant to be returned, that forces people to take reasonable risks to create the value appreciation. Because you can never return that sufficient money through profits. You have to create value in the enterprise and then either sell the business or take it public. So the idea of that you're taking venture capital and that means essentially that you're building a business for the purpose of selling the business, is embedded right in the formation of the business. And this is a subtlety that's hard to understand because you say, well, founding a business to sell it sounds superficial. No, it's only worth something to sell, and you're either selling it by taking it public, because that's selling the business in a way, or selling it to a corporation. You're only selling it, we're talking about selling it for hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, because you're creating huge value. And it's not outside the realm of reasonableness to think in numbers of that scale. So this entrepreneurial process is mapped on this mobility that I was just describing. The relentless pursuit of opportunity, relentless pursuit of resources. And relentlessness is the key. But doing it not as an individual, but with a team. Because no individual has the capacity to manage this kind of dynamic process. So if you're going to have a team, you have to have alignment of interest among the team. And the team are not just the entrepreneurial team inside the company, but also the investors have to be part of the team. And even some would argue the early customers, the stakeholder customers, the lighthouse customers are part of your entrepreneurial team. Because even though they don't have an economic stake in the business, they have a stake because your early customers desperately want you to succeed because they need the product or service that you're offering. And having a global perspective doesn't mean that you're only going to go after existing big markets, but you might start with a beachhead, as Gordon Moore or Clayton Christensen have well described. Start with a beachhead. You're building toward, a small market, discrete market. Remember that market that's willing to accept something that has less global performance, but has a local advantage, a competency they need. And then springboarding the global opportunities when the opportunities present. And building on linkages, because you can't do this from the ground up on your own. It really has to be done in partnership. And you have to learn how to build partnerships. And sometimes those partnerships are formed through social ties, which sociologists call weak ties, through contractual ties, that sociologists call durable bonds, or ties with individuals who really help bridge cultures between two locations. And I like to call those covalent bonds, like in chemistry. You have a single individual having active roles in this cluster of innovation and in another cluster of innovation, and really personally bringing together those two communities. And when those two communities get brought together very closely, you have many linkages like that, and I call that a super cluster of innovation, with the best example being Tel Aviv and Silicon Valley. They really operate to their mutual benefit in a very coordinated way. So it's the behaviors, not just the components. So people say, oh, why is Silicon Valley special or Boston special or whatever? Oh, it's because of the venture capital. No, it's because of all these things and how they behave. And behaving that way allows these communities to lead through innovation. So entrepreneurship is a team sport. It's not a solo effort, and it's an element where you try and have win-win solutions. So this concludes my formal lecture, and I think we've covered the culture of innovation, the culture of entrepreneurship, and the culture of a cluster of innovation. And I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for such an insightful talk. And I think we could get some questions from the audience if there are any. We do have some time left. And while we await for some questions in the chat window, maybe I could ask you one question, which was part of your credentials and your introduction slide. You are also the faculty director of the NSF I-Corps program, which is bringing innovation to, I guess, to the market that originates from the universities. So my question is, we have some limited time here, so this might be a topic for another day, but what are some key success factors that make the NSF I-Corps program effective across multiple university campuses?
Well, thanks for the question, and I'll try and put it in a nutshell. Yeah. I really think it's the role of government, because we created the curriculum, and I say we, it's Professor Blank, who is already on this program, and a couple other professors, myself, created the curriculum, and we were just experimenting with it, but it was visible to the government, because Professor Blank likes to share knowledge and does so through a blog. And without our knowing, the government was sort of looking over our shoulders. And they came in at scale. They said, let's try it. And we tried it at a few locations. We were just at Berkeley and Stanford initially. And then we tried it at a few more with their participation at Georgia Tech and at Michigan and a couple at NYU. And it worked. And then we even tried it in biotech, where we were saying, no, we don't want to try it in biotech. And they said, no, you must. And we tried it at UCSF and University of California, San Francisco, leading institution, and it was working. So they said, let's take this out. So what makes it work is, on a single instance, it's having professors that are willing to take a risk, and students that are willing to take a risk, because it really is allowing the curriculum to be the student experience, and you can't control that the way you can control things if you have a textbook or even a case study. This is a live case study, and having many live case studies in a class at the same time. So everybody's taking a risk together. So it's a culture of shared risk-taking and trust. But then the government had a huge role, because they said, okay, let's do this at 20 universities. And that's where I really took on a role as faculty director, because all of a sudden we had to train many people around the country. And now eventually I continue to do that around the world. And I did that, just to clarify, as national faculty director for 5 years. Then the NSF said, okay, we built this. We don't need, to have that position. So I'm emeritus, if you will, as national faculty director. And there is not a current position there. But we built it in 5 years, and it's ongoing. So the process pays for itself. In other words, the experience pays for itself. It's self-evident that there's value. So it's about trust in the classroom, people taking risks together, and then institutionally, the role of government saying, let's make this happen big. And government can do that.
Nice. So it seems like the government took a message from your lessons. They took a lean startup approach, hypothesis testing with the program, and then scaling it up later once they have a product market fit with the colleges and universities.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's really good. Really good.
So they took your medicine. Okay, so I think there aren't any additional questions in our chat window, but there are a couple of people. Thank you for such an informative session today. Some of our audiences are willing to visit Haas and meet you in person. I certainly had a joy to reconnect with you. My days at UC Berkeley, just looking at your background right there, gives me the joy of reliving the emotions that I had during my Berkeley days.
You should be recognizing the campus, I imagine.
Yes, I do.
So, well, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I want to welcome your students to visit us at Berkeley. And COVID will not last forever, or it will become a routine process like all other viruses. And tomorrow is better than today, and today is not all that bad. So I just thank you, and I wish everybody the best of luck.
Well, thank you very much. It was a joy to have you with us today. Thank you.